This is part 11 of Accurately Handling the Word of Truth. It's a study, there verse by verse, 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. Tonight we're going to be talking about 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8. Probably the most well-known passage in all of the Bible tonight. It's the most well-loved passage in the Bible, I am sure, but it's probably not the most obeyed passage in the Bible. There's always been a disconnect between that which we know and that which we actually are doing, and 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8 is definitely one of those passages that there is definitely a disconnect between what we know about it and what we actually are doing. And I just want to unpack some of that, but just going to do a few comments here beforehand. Now, because this is so familiar to us, we just can't seem to grasp in our 21st century minds the full impact that these words had on the first century Corinthian mind. This was radical. There was an enormity to this that we just can't get because we're so familiar with these words that we are callous to them. And the other thing that we can't understand is what it was like to be a first century Corinthian hearing these words right here. And I didn't put the whole thing up on it, but here's the words, and you can follow along in your scriptures too. It says, charity suffers long and is kind. Charity envieth not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, etc. We could go through the whole thing. And to the ears of a first century Corinthian, this was foreign. Very foreign to them. And what I'm going to do, along with reading this passage, is that I'm going to read little excerpts of what First Corinthian life was like under what's called the patronage system, which they had lived in for century after century after century. And I'm going to compare what it's like by taking historical excerpts of what the thinking of a Corinthian was like in first century and compare that with what Paul is saying in these 4 little verses right here. It is so different. And I hope that you can get a little bit of a taste of it by putting ourselves just briefly, with each phrase of this, putting ourselves in the shoes of a first century Corinthian and what he was hearing at the time. His whole life revolved around self-preservation and self-advancement in the skillful manipulation of what's called patronage. And we've talked about patronage in the past, so I'm not going to get into it. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, you're going to have to go back to previous teachings and find out more about it, because the Corinthians that Paul was writing to, they did not live the lives that we do at all. They were not 21st century Americans. They were first century Corinthians, and it was way different for them. There is no word in the Greek language for the kind of love that is being talked about here. They just did not experience agape. Agape is a very uncommon, rare word in classical Greek. Remember that classical Greek was not being spoken in the first century Corinth. Koine Greek was being spoken in first century Corinth. Classical Greek was only spoken by some of the elite intelligentsia who were scholars. Classical Greek was already aged out of their society. And so what happened is that they took an obscure word from classical Greek that wasn't spoken, and they infused it with Paul infused it with absolutely new meaning. Okay? So did the other apostles. They infused an obscure word that was little known, agape, because there simply wasn't a word for this kind of love in their language or in their experience. They didn't know love. When it says they were without God in the world, I tell you what, it was dark. Even though they had beautiful statuary, even though they had great architecture, they lived in a brutal, cutthroat society. And I'm going to give you a few little hints of that as we go along the way here. It is no wonder that Paul had to give a simple but penetrating description of what love is and what love is not, because they simply did not know. And this was radical stuff. Their understanding of love was what they euphemistically called friendship. That was the word that was used in Corinth at the time, friendship. And you know what friendship meant? It meant, I'm going to give you what you need, and therefore you are obligated to give me what I want. And that's the definition of patronage. And they called it the euphemism friendship. And that it entrapped them in an endless cycle of obligations and repayments and owing of debts and calling in favors. And if you didn't, there was retribution, and it was swift and it was brutal. So let's start by taking a look at Verse 4, charity suffereth long, is kind, charity envieth not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up. One at a time. How do you eat an elephant? You just take it one bite at a time, and that's what we're going to do here. Suffereth long. It means does not retaliate. And all I want to tell you, that was a novel idea. Not retaliate. Here's what it says about patronage, about the life that Corinthians were living. Not meeting one's obligations was a crime. Not meeting one's obligations was a crime. Incurring the hatred and scorn of the community, and punishment was swift. Okay, that's just a little bit of this thing. And when Paul comes along and says, this new love, Christian love thing, this love of God, does not retaliate, does not pay back, does not do retribution, that was like, hey, I don't know if I can live in a society like that, because I will be eaten alive. Long-suffering is love's passive response toward others who cause you suffering. All right? Now, there was no such thing as a passive response in Corinth. In Greek and Roman thinking, there was no such thing as a passive response. Long-suffering was not something that you did. Retaliation was swift. The word long-suffering is a compound word. It means, makros, the first part means goes a long way. And thumos is the second part of it, and that means boil, to boil, or to have a temper or a disposition of mind. And long-suffering is the temper that goes a long, long ways. It will boil for a long time before it becomes angry. Long-suffering is often mistaken for weakness. In Corinth, long-suffering would be immediately mistaken for weakness. But the thing about it is, in our culture, in our society, we find and we bump into this as you try to practice long-suffering, it will be misunderstood as you're not being long-suffering to that which is wrong. You simply are too weak to do anything about it. Okay? Now, the other thing that's mistaken is that long-suffering is often mistaken as not caring. You could do something about injustice. You could do something about the wrong, but you don't care enough, and that's why you are so long-tempered. That's why you haven't reached the breaking point and retaliated against wrong, because you don't care about wrong. You allow wrong to go on. And that's the issue that with the Corinthian mind, and also with the human mind, the worldly mind, misunderstands. If you are trying to be long-suffering, in other words, you are trying to love like God loves, it will be misunderstood as weakness or apathy at times. Some will misunderstand it. All right. Number 2 is kind. We could say love is kind there, but the King James just simply goes on to, it just says is kind. Okay, and is kind seeks the benefit of others without thought of return. Now look at what that sounded like to a Corinthian. Seeks benefit of others without thought of return. Their whole society was based on giving benefits with the expectation and with the demand that there be a return to you. Here's what it says. Here's what the historians say about society in Corinth. One was obligated to repay in full for favors received. There is no word for kindness in secular Greek. Here's another one that in secular Greek, they had no term for benefiting others without thought of return. You always expected a return. And if you didn't get a return, then there was going to be enmity and retaliation. And this was going on constantly, from slaves all the way to the emperor. Kindness means gentleness in word and behavior. It is kindness, see, long-suffering is the passive response of love toward those who cause you suffering. Guess what the active response is? Those who cause you suffering in Corinth, those who cause you suffering in Minnesota, Guess what the active response is? Retaliation. You repay in kind. And here's what it says that happens with the active response of love. It is gentleness in word and behavior. Can you see where that could be misunderstood in our culture? That you are trying to love, you are deciding, I am going to love, and you know what it looks like to everybody around you? It just simply looks like you are weak. Kindness is the work of a Christian. It's hard work to do this. It takes a lot. It needs the power of God in order to be able to do this. Now, one of the problems with kindness is that it can be easily substituted among Christians, so that it's not a matter of being gentle and gracious in word and in conduct toward everybody, but guess what it gets to be? It gets to be, I am only gracious and gentle in word and contact to those who are technically or doctrinally correct. And guess who decides what correctness means? Each person decides that for themselves. Okay? And kindness only extends as far as those who are doing it right. Those who are correct in either a doctrinal or a technical way. And kindness does not go beyond that. If you're not doing it right, suddenly those correct people become unkind people. And they do that all in the name of righteousness. I am being right about this. You are not being right about it, and therefore kindness is not something I will extend to you. Next one. There are upright people that are very upright, but they are also unkind. And they think they're doing it in the name of righteousness. Envieth not is the next one in the list here. Envieth not does not jealously strive to obtain that which is not his. Okay? Or does not deprive another of what is his. In a patronage society, pillaging of one's property was a consequence of failure to repay. It happened very quickly, and people were hoping that you could not repay because then they could have all your stuff. And it was the law. It was the law for that to happen. So part of patronage was to put people in a situation where they could not repay, and then you could have everything they had along the way. Now, envieth is the Greek word zelau. Have any of you heard the word zelau before? Just last week we were talking about zelau. Guess what? I said that there was a whole bunch of places where Paul uses the word zelau. Well, here's the next one right here. Although in chapter 12, verse 31, it said earnestly desire, right? Well, guess what? The very same word 4 verses later, and they translate it as envy. Okay. Problem is that if zelau means the same thing in both places, if zelo means earnestly desire in chapter 12, verse 31, and then four verses later, the same guy, Paul, turns around and says that love never does zelo. How can you have Paul in one place saying you must zelo? You have to zelo. And 4 verses later, Paul is saying love does not zelo. It is very easy for people to overlook that because of the translations that are used. You got to know that there are people that are wrestling with these terms and saying, either both statements are true, and then what are you going to do with the character of Paul? If Paul in one spot says, you must do this, and then just a couple of verses later he says, if you have God's love in you, you will never do this. So we have a conflict there if they both say the same thing. My contention has been that they do say the same thing, but zelo is to be understood in both places as something negative that you should not do. In chapter 12, verse 31, where he says, you zelo the best gifts, that is a bad thing. He was accusing them. He was not encouraging them to do that. He was saying, you jealously strive after things that you have not been given. And in in chapter 13, verse 4, he is using zelo exactly the same way. In its unfavorable, negative way, love does not jealously strive after things that have not been given to it. Thou shalt not zelo. We found that out way back in the 10 Commandments. Don't zelo. And to start messing with those terms and say zelo is a good thing in one spot and zelo is a bad thing in another spot is going to really confuse a lot of people. And guess what we have today? Yeah, kind of a confused mess. Next one, vaunteth not itself. Those are words that we don't use in our language. Does not announce one's own worth or use attention-seeking speech or behavior by exaggerating about oneself or flattering others. That's all encapsulated in the word vaunteth. Now, you can say boasts, and that's fine, but you got to understand what boast means. This is the thing that we have a problem with, is that when it says boast here, it's saying love never does this. But there's other places that our translation says, I boast in Christ. I boast in my weaknesses. I boast in the gospel. I boast as if it is a good thing. That is something that really needs to look by any student of the Word. They need to look at that and see what in the world is going on. In one place, boasting is something you should never do. And in another place, it says, Paul the Apostle says, I boast. I boast. Therein lies another one of those things, because vaunteth, especially here, is not talking about the same word at all. And I'm not going to go into the details of the different words here because time is always not on my side here. But boast can mean several different things throughout the scriptures. But in this case, what vaunteth means is it means attention-getting speech and behavior to announce one's own worth. Here's the thing about boasters, is that they must get others to think highly of them. I am one of these guys that has struggled most of my life with the thing that there is only one thing that's worse, or one of the worst things that could possibly happen to me is if somebody didn't think highly of me. Okay, I have run into other people who say, I never thought of it that way, but that's my problem too, is that they got to have the approval of others. It's called, by Paul, he calls it the fear of man. And is it that you fear being approved of? No, you fear being disapproved of. It can't get any worse than that. You fear it to the point where you cannot stand to have somebody or to know somebody or to suspect that somebody is not approving of you. I'll tell you what, many of us in these days are being tested really strongly on this thing to find out how you doing, Gary, knowing that someone does not approve of you. How are you doing in your heart? Can you still have joy knowing that somebody is disappointed with you? Can you still have peace, the peace of God in your heart, realizing that people disapprove of you, are disappointed in you? They don't like what you are and they don't like what you're doing. How are you doing with that? And you know what? There's something deep inside that says life is not worth living if people are disappointed in me. It's a weakness. It's been there a long time. It's something that God is definitely working on. Here's the thing that when Paul says love does not vaunt itself, it does not do this attention-seeking kind of behavior and speech. It does not announce its own worth. We have a saying, and in my family there was this saying, and I've read it and I've heard about it by other people, where it says this: it says, one must speak up for oneself, one's life, and one's ways. One must speak up for oneself. And that is a euphemistic way of saying you must announce your own worth because nobody else will. The thing about it is if nobody announces your worth, in fact, they're announcing that you don't have much worth. How are you doing? Can you sustain that? Here I am at my age, and I'm being tested on that myself. Here's what it says about the life that Corinthians were living. It says, a primary motive for granting favors among the Corinthians was to be publicly praised and to have monuments erected in their honor and inscriptions carved in marble that praised them. Archaeology has found lots of these where people were granting favors so that statues and placards and all kinds of reliefs were made to praise them and honor them. It was a motive that could cause people to do just about anything. And that was a way of life for them. And so when Paul says, love doesn't brag, love does not speak up for oneself. Love does not do attention-seeking behavior by exaggerating or by flattering others. See, those are two of the big things that happen in those. So the person who loves realizes that all that it could boast about has been given to them by God without earning any of it. In fact, I'm just going to read one thing, just a couple of chapters before this, where Paul is talking to this same bunch of people who thought that boasting was the way that you had to operate there. He says this. I got to find it here. What do you have that you did not receive from God? Okay. Well, I have a master's degree. Well, how did you get a master's degree? Well, I had to do these things. How could you possibly do those things if God had not given you at least some perseverance and talent and everything? Well, I did it on my own. Really? In other words, Paul is trying to get at this thing that says, I'm a self-made man. And he says, what do you have that wasn't given to you by God? Now, if you did receive it from God, why do you boast as if you had not received it, but you had earned it yourself? So this is the kind of thing that Paul is addressing several times through here, is because they live in a society that says you have to boast. If you're going to get ahead, if you're going to advance, you have to boast more than the next guy does. And Paul is saying, there's another way. There is another way. This was pretty tough stuff. By the way, you know that when they received this letter from Paul, they did not like it. They did not like what Paul had to say here. When he says, if you're going to be a Christian, then there's love involved in that, and love does not boast, and love does not jealously seek to get what it has not been given. And they're going, that's hard. That's hard. And you know what their response was? You're not our apostle. You're not our apostle at all. Let's take a look at this next one here. Is not puffed up. I like this one in a way because we have our own word for these kinds of people. Puffed up, it means to swell up by blowing, to inflate as a bellows. I think we all know what bellows here. Probably younger people don't know what a bellows is. It's a leather bag that you fill it full of air, and then you apply pressure to it, and it blows that air back out again to heat a smelting fire. The thing about it is that this one here is self-inflating. Is that where do you get the air so that you can swell yourself up? By the way, guess what we call these? We call them windbags. And that's actually what Paul is talking about here too, is self-inflated. You do the blowing to inflate yourself. Okay? Both those that are attention-seeking and vaunting themselves and those that are puffed up are constantly talking about themselves. Constantly. They have to talk about themselves. Paul accuses the Corinthians of being puffed up 6 times in this letter. Six times along the way, and in each one of those, and I'm not going to go through them, but in each one of them he says you're puffed up, and here's what happens when you're puffed up. And he gives not only the accusation, but he also gives the consequences of what it's like, or what will happen if you are puffed up. It's not pretty. You should look at it. You should look at it yourself. Just look up puffed up in your concordance, and you will find that there's 6 of them there, and you'll find out what the life of a windbag is really like. Not the way he says his life is, because he'll tell you that he's the greatest and his life is the greatest and his stuff is the best and he does the most wonderful things of all, and he just can't quit talking about himself. But the life of a windbag, Paul will tell you the real truth of it. Next verse is verse 5. Doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh not evil. Unseemly is the word askemon, and it means a distorted or twisted form. It means misrepresentation and misinterpretation. It does not mean, as almost every translation will tell you, it does not mean indecent. Is not seemly has to do with misrepresenting and doing that which is unseemly and making it sound like you're doing something seemly. It does not speak or act in a rude manner, an unkind manner, wrongly translated as indecent. And almost every commentator will tell you that there is 3 things that Paul was leveling accusation at them about. One was sexual behavior, and you find that in chapter 7:36, where a young man is behaving in an unseemly manner toward his girlfriend, okay? The word unseemly comes up in 11:6 when it has to do with women's clothing, although it doesn't talk about women's clothing. It's talking about head coverings, and we've talked about that a lot in the past. But women's clothing is indecent. Sexual behavior is indecent. And behavior of rich toward the poor at the Lord's Supper was indecent, because those all use some root word of the word unseemly, but unseemly does not mean indecent. It means distorted, misrepresented. It's trying to say that something is well-formed when it is actually not well-formed at all. And here is the place, I think, where love gets distorted, misrepresented, and misinterpreted in our presence, our church society right here. It says it is this thing that there is rude and mean-hearted criticism and fault-finding that is unseemly behavior. And everybody would say, I agree. Mean-hearted criticism and fault-finding is unseemly behavior, but it is misrepresented, it is misinterpreted and excused as just being honest. Or the big term among spiritual-sounding people is walking in the light. In other words, there are people that would never be caught with any kind of sexual indecency. No clothing would be indecent. There would never have any kind of rude behavior at the Lord's Supper. Heaven forbid that they would ever do any of those things, and yet they are on a regular basis saying rude, mean-hearted things to other people and calling it just being honest. Just being honest. You know, we got to walk in the light. And it is unseemly behavior that is not well understood or represented by the commentators and the teachers of today. They think that we're still stuck in outward appearances when the unseemly behavior that is destroying in the church and hurting in the church is this thing where there is things being said that are very damaging, and they're excused, and not only excused, but called righteous and good. Because just being honest. Just being honest. Seeks not her own. That does not plot, strive, or endeavor to obtain what God has not willed to give. And one of those things we talked about in the past was the grace expressions. Earnestly desire the best gifts. God's in charge of giving the best gifts. You don't get to decide what the best gifts are. The other thing that I want to say is, seeks not her own. That is a very difficult passage, because to our mind is seeks not her own what? Seeks not her own what? And there's a lot of things that could be filled in that blank there, but you got to fill it in with what are you seeking as your own? Your own point of view, your own opinion, your own rights, your own security. Those are things that love does not seek for herself. Those are the ones that I wanted to point out at this along the way here. Seeks not her own. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of that stuff. There's two ways to insist upon your rights or to remember your responsibilities. Okay. Insist upon your rights and be preoccupied with your rights and insisting upon your rights, or to remember your responsibilities. The Corinthians were constantly preoccupied with their rights. In fact, they had a whole section of Roman law that had to do with nothing but the law of obligations. And they just had this down to a science. What other people owed me. And if they did not give me what I wanted, then here's what I could do to them. And there was a whole section of law called the law of obligations. And that has to do with a way of life where you're seeking your own. Now, the thing about it is that you can't press this point too far to total disregard of one's health, one's property, one's welfare. And above all, you cannot disregard your own salvation. So when it says seek not your own, it's talking about the pursuit of those things becomes the main thing in your life. When it becomes the main thing instead of a secondary thing, because guess what you're supposed to be seeking first? That's when it becomes selfishness. But there is a seeking first. And God, being the good judge, or the good Lord that he is, realizes that we do need to maintain some of these things along the way. So it's not, as Paul was probably the example of seeking not his own, probably more than anybody else, that is not the life that everyone is called to. But when this small thing of maintenance in your life becomes the main thing in your life, then it's turned to selfishness. It's not easily provoked is the next one in the list there. And you notice in there is that I've crossed out the word easily. I don't know why they put that in there. Maybe they just couldn't stand the fact that love is not provoked. The word easily is not in there. That's right. Love is not provoked. It does not take offense. Are we being tested on this or what? We are living as I've said in the past, is that one way to find out if a stillborn calf has really got any life in it, stick a straw up its nose, see what happens. Well, guess what? Provocation is the straw up our nose. We'll find out whether we're alive and well or not. Just say or do something that offends, and we'll see what happens there. We'll find out, yeah, you're alive and kicking. You're alive and kicking there, and that you're not provoked. A client, here's what it says about the life that the Corinthians were living. A client who was ungrateful. And you know what ungrateful meant? It meant he was late on his payments. Would receive the hatred and the scorn of his neighbors. Any lapse in obligations would create enmity. It wasn't just a matter of, there was no place for not being provoked. If there was the slightest deviation from the high expectation that your neighbors had of you, guess what? You would receive hatred. And those enmity relationships would be passed on from generation to generation. Guess where the word vendetta comes from? Right. In good old Greco-Roman world. Right here. So, not easily provoked, not provoked. If you said that to a Corinthian at the time, he'd say, how could I possibly live as a Christian? This Christian stuff, I'm going to get eaten alive, and if I can't retaliate, guess what? I don't think I have a life in Corinth anymore. This is the radical thing that was happening there. In countries around the world where there's a patronage culture and society, this is exactly what Christians are facing. Is that when they read the 4 verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 there, and they realize there's no way I can possibly survive in my society and love at the same time. And guess what? They are making the decision to love anyway, and guess what's happening to them? They're being eaten alive. They're being eaten alive. But they're choosing to do it. They're choosing to love instead of go back into their patronage, dog-eat-dog societies, cultures. Okay. Guess what provoked means? It means to sharpen alongside. And that's as a metaphor term for sharpening a dagger which is to be used on someone alongside you. This isn't something that's done at a distance. This provocation, this easily offended, taking offense, it happens amongst close people. It happens, and it's sharp, and it's a stab, and it's a dagger, and it happens between people that are right alongside each other. David said it. He says, I could have handled this if it had been my enemy. But this has happened right alongside me. On the way here. Thinketh no evil. Does not calculatingly consider the wrong done to oneself. The word thinketh there is a very interesting word. It's a bookkeeping term. You know that there's nobody like the Romans and Greek for keeping records. They wrote down everything, and there was a reason why they wrote down everything, and it wasn't because they were so interested in the future posterity. They wrote down everything, and they were taking an inventory, is what the word logizomai means. They take an inventory of the evil that is done to them, totaling up the debts so as to not be forgotten, with the intent of repaying in kind. That's what it means when it says, thinketh no evil. They were constantly adding up the wrongs and the obligations and what everybody owed them so that it would never be forgotten. You do not forget. And it can be surprising to find out what is still being remembered and inventoried in Christian circles along the way. I tell you what, these warm, fuzzy little verses that are put on every plaque in every Christian home around the world are shocking, and they dig a lot deeper than we think. And we realize that if we think the Corinthian society was harsh, and it was, but they had it out in the open, we've got it more what's the word? More sophisticated a lot of times, because this thing is still going on where people are keeping an inventory. And Paul says, if you're going to be a Christian, and if you're going to say, the love of God has been shed abroad in my heart by the Holy Spirit, which has been given unto me, you must throw away your book of inventory. In other words, thinketh no evil means forget the evil that was done. Forget it. Because the reason why inventories are kept is so that you never forget. You never forget it. And God calls us to forget it, just like He forgets it. Aren't you glad He forgets it? Colossians is a book that we're studying. It says that He took this inventory that was against us, the totaling up of the debt that we owed Him, and guess what He did with it? He nailed it to Jesus Christ's cross, and He forgot it. We don't find it that easy. Along the way here to do that. I I got a couple more minutes here. I'm going to do verse 6. Just quickly, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Rejoices not in iniquity. I like this one. Does not delight in unrighteousness is what I have put down there. But the thing is that the word rejoice is a very interesting word. We use the word rejoice all the time in what we're, in our Christian language. Rejoice in the Lord always, and things like that. But rejoice means to be enjoying. Rejoiceth means to be enjoying, be glad, be delighted, have pleasure in. And here's what he's saying. It rejoices, it does not rejoice in iniquity. Iniquity, on the other hand, has to do with that which is not right. Look at two verses that Paul writes, one to the Romans and one to the Thessalonians, where he says that he uses the word rejoice, and yet it's not used as the word rejoice, but it is the word. They use the word have pleasure, and rejoice means to have pleasure. But guess what? You can have pleasure in unrighteousness. Look at Romans 1:32. They have pleasure in them that do them. And what he's talking about, what is them? What are they doing? Unrighteousness. And people are not doing the unrighteousness, but they're rejoicing in those that do them. This is called vicarious sinning. That's a term that I have come up with, but it's the fact is that you enjoy the wrong that others are doing. You enjoy it. You take pleasure in it. You like it. You like to imagine it. You like hearing it. You like visualizing it. You like thinking about the unrighteousness that other people do. And that's, we didn't do it. We didn't do it, but I sure enjoyed watching somebody else do it. And then there's another equally important and legitimate idea about this. It has to do with enjoying the wrong that is done to others. I tell you what, there's just something perverse in every single one of us. No matter how loving and kind we are in this area, that we find that we are not that loving. We do not have agape in us. Is that when misfortune falls somebody else, there is part of us that likes it. Find out that another church in town is having trouble, guess what? There's part of us that says, good, we look better. We look better now. Someone receives the consequence of their wrongdoing, and we're happy about it. There's part of us that's happy about it. We say, oh, that's too bad. Oh, that's really tragic. Oh, man, how are they doing? And things like that. And then there's part of us inside that is taking pleasure in the fact that they had a downfall, enjoying seeing someone downfall. And that is part of this thing too, is that in patronage society, when someone fell down, that meant that somebody else was profiting from it. There was only one sin in Greco-Roman religion. You know what it was? It was the sin of failure to meet one's obligations. And if you were caught in a sin in Greco-Roman culture, everybody rejoiced in that iniquity because everybody was going to get a piece of your pie, just like a pack of wolves closing in on someone who got a broken leg. Because if you were caught in the sin of ingratitude, you were pillaged swiftly. Therefore, they rejoiced in iniquity all the time. They loved it. We're a little bit more toned down about it, but there is part of us in our hearts that rejoices in iniquity along the way. That's as far as I can go tonight. I wish I could have concluded all this, but it's always